The following program is sponsored by The Greek, Ely's Radio Shack dealer at 570 Altman in downtown Ely, and brought to you as a public service by Georgetown Media in Ely, Nevada. Ely City Council meeting, January 28th, 2021.
Yeah, I would like to hear what they have to say too, but I think Mr. Allworth does have a valid point on the MOU.
And so there's no MOU at this point. That's what
Right, but it does say proposed
Yeah.
MOU.
And there's no proposed MOU at this point. So this language was actually produced. Our intention was to have a proposed MOU at this meeting, but there's not.
And that's how it reads, yeah.
What was that?
Yeah, and that's how I read it.
Right.
Should
So
have
there
in
won't.
front of us tonight.
Yeah. So now it's just a discussion of what that MOU term sheet would include and what that might look like in the future.
But Mr. Attorney, if I was strictly just interested in that item, I would have came down here personally to see the proposed memorandum of understanding. That's the way I look at the word, it's proposed. If I was, it's not that clear in my mind. If somebody wants to, I'll come down here just for that item to see the proposed memorandum of understanding. And the fact that at the commission meeting, they stated they're in negotiations with the city and the railroad. Or it was stated on the document. So
They have presented a term sheet that's under review.
Any other discussion or
Who's
questions?
reviewing it then?
What was that?
Who's reviewing it?
Me. Me.
Okay.
Excuse me, the term sheet's also in
Okay.
And that's all that's in the packet. I didn't see an MOU, so there's just a term sheet, and they're here tonight to propose what they might like and something like that, for a discussion anyway. Okay, further discussion? Then I'll take a vote. All in favor?
to my agenda, I can't pull it off.
Are you in favor of that as well?
No.
I have one aye, and then all opposed?
Nay.
Nay.
So 2-1, that motion dies. We still need to approve an agenda here. How does this work tonight? I want to make sure I'm doing this right.
So
Do we need to just ask for another motion?
a motion is.
Okay.
Move to approve.
Do I have a second?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We've got 3 in favor. We'll move forward with item 4, city departments. Reports, fire chief. Start with you, Chief Stork. Any questions for the fire chief? Okay. Police chief. Any questions for the police chief? Thank you, Scott. Municipal court judge, Judge Coster.
Thank you. I'm going to claim those additional 6 minutes. Actually, I don't need that long. But I do have a few things to tell you about tonight. Thank you for having me on the agenda. You may have seen in the supplemental reports, there are essentially 3 things I'm going to touch on tonight, a minute or 2 each. The first is simply the standard monthly report that we send to the state of Nevada. It's routine, nothing remarkable, and I did not do a copy for my own reference on that. Item 2 is a discussion or the presentation of what we learned from the state Nevada Supreme Court's annual report. Their fiscal year runs until June 30th of 2020. Call that fiscal year 2020, same as the financial cycle. So we learned, as other courts did, what happened to our workload last year. And I wanted to give you a couple key figures on that. You can flip back and find where I kind of annotated the 1 page that's obviously out of their annual report. About 3 pages, 4 pages. But here's what there is to know. In traffic cases, we were down 28% last year in the year that ended June 30th. Our disposition, meaning the percentage of cases we closed, was at 92%, which is about the same as it was previous year. I mean, we closed just about as many cases as came in previous year. Probably wouldn't have been the same amount, but for the fact we did have a lot of changes in attorney going on during the year, and so they were playing catch up through the process. The state doesn't worry too much about the disposition rate as long as we're not getting big backlogs. But keep that in mind. 28% reduction in new cases, 92% reduction in disposition. Sorry, we had 92% of normal disposition, 8% reduction. Now, on the criminal side, this would be for that 12 months ended June 30th. We had a 36% reduction in criminal cases. Criminal cases in our court mean misdemeanors on down to routine traffic. You could technically be parking, but there's no parking. It's part of what's mentioned on the report, but we never get parking tickets. There aren't any. Our disposition rate on crime, though, criminal cases went up 180, went to 183%, which is 83% more than we had done the previous year. And I want to use that as a point to commend our clerks for having used some of that reduced work time in court to work very hard to catch up on old case dispositions. People who moved out of state with the assistance of the collection agency, and a little more letter writing, order to show cause, prospective bench warrants. A lot of old stale cases got cleaned out of the system. They really did a great job. 183% normal. So that covers that report coming from the state. Of course, we're slightly more than halfway through court fiscal year 2021, and we'll again get a report next December probably after they do all their analysis. Are there any questions that I can answer about that? The one key page that pertains to this judicial district and had, of course, that includes Lincoln County and Eureka County, but that has our court listed is there, and without getting too bold, I circled the figures that were critical for us. I would say one more thing, and that is that you can expect that the report for next year, when we talk next December probably about it, will also show some reduction in cases because much of the COVID period fell into fiscal year 2021. It's currently ongoing.
In this district, there's only one other municipal court besides ourselves, isn't that correct? There would be Caliani.
Yeah, Caliani, the one in Panaca is closed. So, yeah.
Is there a municipal court in Panaca?
Caliani's now closed as well.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Is Caliani closed?
They've closed it.
Okay. And it's all going to justice court now?
Justice Court, San Luis.
It's worth mentioning that we had a small reduction because state decisions relating to domestic violence ended up by state rule and the district attorney's decision all being assigned, whether they occurred in the city or not, all being assigned to the justice court. So we lost, there aren't a lot of those cases, but we lost 100% of them that would normally have come to the municipal court. However, the state may be changing their rule. I just learned from the clerk's office that might bring them back to the municipal court come, I'm thinking, the end of the legislative period or sometime in the summer.
Is that because they're expecting the legislature to give some guidance on that rule that
Well, I haven't
domestic
spoken to
courts need
Nicole
to
yet.
have?
I wish I could give you the specific. I just got an email from her today saying what was in the offing. A Supreme Court case came along that decided that because of the loss of firearms use, both by federal and state law, in the case of a domestic violence conviction, it had constitutional right implications that were great enough that a defendant had to be afforded an opportunity to have their case heard by a jury. Since by law, by the NRS, municipal courts in the state of Nevada cannot do jury trials, the district attorney decided, rather than trying to sort them out early on, he just sent them all to the justice court so that because they have the authority to handle the jury trials. Now, we miss having them, we'd like to have it, we'd like to have the caseload. It's not a lot of cases, but that is, of course, on the serious end of the spectrum of the cases we do. All right, so we'd like to have them back and to share that workload with the justice court. But I did not know until I got to work this morning and had some email from Nicole Baldwin learning that the state judiciary is seeking legislative authority to let the municipal court do jury trials. The only jury trials the Judge Bishop Court, Justice Court, or municipal court could do would be domestic violence jury trials. But that's in the works, and how gelled it is, how likely it is to happen, I do not know. So I'm sure that was confusing enough. So I'm welcome to call at any time and visits as well. Let me cover the last thing, which I think you might find more interesting, even more interesting. The last page in the attachment we have is a little one-page form that the state generally formed, and the ladies in our office retyped into our court's form, dealing with the determination about whether to release people on their own recognizance or to release them with conditions on their release, or ultimately to keep them in jail under a bail. And the city attorney has mentioned, you know, at one point or another in other context, this state Supreme Court came up with a decision clarifying that within Nevada, every defendant has a presumptive right to pretrial release. To keep them in jail, the court gave us a specific, I won't say crosswalk, a checklist we have to follow. First of all, the charging body, which would be the city of Ely, through their city attorney, has to seek to have them held. Whatever the charge is, major, minor, whatever, would have to seek to have them held, which is a pretty rare instance anyway. Secondly, I can grant that if I determine, this is the take-home on this, you say, two important considerations. Is the defendant a risk to public safety between now and trial? And lawyers can debate whether that's making determinations about guilt in the ultimate trial or not, but you have to make a determination whether they're public hazard to having them out on the street. And secondly, do they have a history or a likelihood of not appearing at their next court appearance? If they fail either of those tests, then they can be held in jail. And the third step, is that clear? Because that's really the important part. The third step then is, if they're held in jail, is bail a reasonable alternative, or other alternatives such as home detention, travel restrictions, denying them the right to drive through trial, or something like that. The movement nationally, certainly within Nevada, is to not hold people in jail pre-trial. Get them out. Don't treat, you know, the layman might say, they don't treat them as guilty when they haven't been proven guilty.
Judge Coster, in the conversation you and I had a couple weeks ago, I was asking about how many people are generally incarcerated annually from our municipal court, and as I recall, the number was quite low to non-existent anyway. Does this form come up a lot or have a lot of bearing?
I probably use that form 3 times a month.
3 times a month?
3 times a month. The reason there's a form, as happens over time, the courts want certain critical decisions recorded in the file. So, if we do hold someone, you can see it's essentially a score sheet. How long have they been in the area? Did they have previous non-appearances? You know, what criteria goes either to that public safety or that risk of absconding decision. Score it, and then at the bottom it says, are there any other overwhelming reasons to say release them or don't release them anyway? That you record that score, and that goes in their file to show that there was a thoughtful, individualized review, and it has to be done with the person in front of you. It can no longer be done just looking at the file while someone's down the hallway in the jail. Say, well, we're going to hold them.
I guess my question being that this kind of new guidance doesn't really affect in practice what we're doing, but does leave more of a paper trail.
It's more of a paper trail. It has not increased. It's perhaps slightly decreased the number of people that are in jail under municipal court orders over the 4 years that I've had the honor to do.
Okay.
That was the third of the points, a little longer than I thought. Are there any questions? As you look through the attachment materials, I really do invite any calls. And on a related note, if you haven't seen the new courthouse yet, they do about once a week set up, not so much a tour, but a walkthrough for people to see the space they'll be occupying. It's looking really good in there. You might, if you haven't seen it yet, I know the mayor has. It'd be.
And I would encourage anyone on the council who'd like to do that
Yeah.
to certainly get that set up. It's well worth a look around. They're doing quite a job up there.
They are. It looks good, and of course it's not a finished shape, but you can get a good sense of what it's going to look like. And they have really put a lot of thought into the design. It's going to be truly state-of-the-art facility, I think, is a fair statement. As well as being energy efficient and offices with nice views. They've really covered a lot of these.
Okay. Thank you, Judge Costa.
All right, thank you. I promise a similar session a year from now.
City Attorney.
Nothing to report.
Nothing to report. City Clerk. Okay. City Treasurer. Okay. City Public Works Supervisor.
Nothing to report.
City Water Operator. City Engineer. I know that he's here tonight. City Building Official.
Nothing else to report.
Okay. If there are no questions for any of those from the council, we'll move on to item 5, City Council reports. We'll start with Councilman Beasley. Okay. Councilman Howard.
No report, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. Councilman Carson.
No report.
Okay. I did want to report that I did have a League of Cities conference call with mayors in the rest of the state, and I really have to hand it to our health officials. We are just heads and shoulders above what's going on in the rest of the state as far as vaccine distribution. They have just been very effective in getting those vaccines out to people. We're working down the priority list quite a bit faster than a lot of other cities our size, and certainly bigger cities where it's a much more logistical issue to do that. So my hat's off to our public health nurse and our public health officer in the hospital and Economy Drug and everybody who stepped up to be doing that. We really do appreciate the work they've been doing. Item 6, items for discussion, possible action only of the Ely City Council. The consent agenda, we have minutes from January 6th and bills from January 11th and January 20th.
I'll make a motion, Mr. Mayor, to approve the minutes and the bills.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Seconded by Councilman Carson. Any questions or corrections on any of those? Hearing none, I'll call for the vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Carried, so ordered. We'll move on to B, new business. Mayor Robertson, R Plus Energy's representatives Matthew Shapiro and Luigi Resta, discussion only, presentation on White Pine Pump Storage Hydro Project and proposed memorandum of understanding allowing the White Pine Water Power LLC to realign approximately 5 miles of railway owned by the Nevada Northern Railway Foundation and the City of Ely. Mr. Shapiro, thanks for coming tonight.
Thank you, Mayor, council members. Matthew Shapiro, CEO of R Plus Hydro. This is Luigi Resta.
CEO of R Plus Energies. And I'll say, because of the earlier objection, that our intention today was to come and introduce the project and go through the PowerPoint that you have, which is really the fundamentals of what the project looks like. So maybe Matthew can do that, and then I can answer some of the business questions and concerns that you may have as far as scheduling and public notice and engagement of the community. So if you go through the project first, then we can answer those questions, if that works for the council. Mayor?
Please.
Great. So I actually first came to Ely about 10 years ago after identifying this site as potentially promising for pump storage, but not much happened for a lot of reasons, just the market not being ready, among other things. But in the past year or so, things have ramped up quite a bit. So R Plus Energies is a renewable energy development firm based in Salt Lake, active in wind, solar, solar plus battery, and pump storage hydro with R Plus Hydro. And R Plus Hydro was formed as a partnership between R Plus Energies and GridFlex, which I formed in 2009, specifically to focus on this type of project. So right now we're working on 10 pumped storage hydropower projects across the United States. This being our leading, I would say, project in a lot of ways. So I'm on page 2 here. So White Pine Pump Storage is a closed-loop pump storage project. That means it doesn't involve any existing rivers or lakes. It involves 2 reservoirs located at 2 different elevations. We look for the highest possible drop over the shortest possible distance. And it serves as an energy storage project because when you have low-cost energy or surplus energy in the middle of the day with solar in the middle of the night, you pump from the lower to the upper. And then when you need power, and the grid needs power, you can flexibly reverse it and draw water from the upper to the lower. And it's a 2,000-foot drop, so it's a tremendous amount of power you get out of a smaller amount of water when you have a vertical drop like that. It's about 8 miles northeast of Ely. It's sized at 1,000 megawatts of generating and pumping capacity for 8 hours. And that's equivalent to about 1/7 of the state's peak power demand. 1/8. So it's a tremendous amount of power packed into a pretty small area. The interconnection point would be Robinson Summit Substation, which is about 23 miles away. It's almost entirely on BLM lands. It would require 5,200 acre feet to fill, about 5,300 actually. And then once that fill occurs, you're just moving the same water up and down, and your only makeup need after that is evaporation makeup water. Target online date is 2030, so take about 5 years to build. If everything went according to plan, begin in 2025, 2030. Project would have a lifespan of 80 years plus, because once you build the infrastructure for these, they really pretty much last forever. And it's a $2 billion plus investment. So I described how pump storage works. You're moving water up and down. There are 43 of these already operating in the United States, but none have been built in about 25 years because of changing economics in the energy business. But now, with the surge in renewable energy hitting the grid, there's a lot of interest in energy storage, and thus these types of projects. And it is the best established, lowest cost form of large-scale energy storage. And it's really driven by that renewable energy situation in Nevada, 50% renewable by 2030, and then potentially 100% by 2050. That's a lot of solar energy and wind, intermittent and variable. It needs storage to make use of it and be able to keep the lights on when you need the power. So that's the main driver. And this project could be a keystone, a cornerstone to the state's future energy storage capability. So this location has the rare combination of features we look for. We look for that high vertical drop over a short distance, proximity to a source of fill water, proximity to transmission. It's in a great location that's very strategic on the transmission system. Construction access, a strong market. It meets all of those. Good topography that minimizes the size of the dams needed to store that amount of water. So slide 5, I covered that. 6 is a transmission map showing current and planned transmission to be that NV Energy is planning to build out to the west, and then other potential lines that could be built right through that substation Robinson Summit. Slide 7 is kind of an overview of the project footprint. The upper reservoir site is about 60-acre footprint at 8,500 feet elevation, and the Duck Creek Range, the lower, is about 80 acres surface area in the valley. We can talk, and we'll have lots of time for questions afterwards. So we've been focusing on feasibility engineering. We go through a very iterative process, high-level engineering, looks good, no fatal flaws, goes to the next detailed stage. Interconnection agreement with utility is very important to have early on, so we have secured that because you have to reserve your place you have to get in line to use that transmission capacity, otherwise it's taken up by other parties. There are many permits and licenses that the project needs from the federal level, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It needs a FERC license, which is the longest lead time item. It needs a BLM right-of-way. We're working on an SUP that's been submitted to the planning department. We have borehole investigations that are planned. That's kind of the next step in the engineering to see what the geology is like underneath surface level, so we can confirm the viability for the project planning. Field work that looks at cultural, environmental, all the impacts that the project might have. We have a lot of exhibits that have to be prepared for the license application, and all of that also as well for the BLM. We need to finalize a water agreement, water sourcing agreement with the county for that initial fill water and then make up water as time goes by. And then we'll get into the reason why we've been in discussion with the railway informally starting about a year ago and then getting more formal now. Originally, the lower reservoir location was between the upper and lower track. So that was fine from the, in terms of, not directly impacting the railroad potential views. However, the initial engineering study showed that the geology down in that area is alluvial rock, and you don't want to have to tunnel through alluvial rock. It's very expensive and challenging. So the engineers strongly recommended moving the reservoir upslope, which meant in the pathway of the upper track, the High Line track. And that, based on feedback from the railroad in terms of the maximum kind of grade that the railroad can operate on, and the curves, the maximum curves, the realignment either below or above the new reservoir would have to be about a 5-mile stretch. If the grade could be steeper, that could be a shorter stretch. But so originally, and one of the maps, which I'll show on slide 10, you'll see the lower reservoir, and then there's a track showing a realignment below the lower reservoir. Mark Bassett asked if the realignment, if it had to happen, could be above the lower reservoir, so that the view would not be as disruptive and potentially could be even better than it currently is. And so the engineers looked at that and determined that yes, that would be not only viable, potentially even more attractive than realigning it lower down the valley. And so that's what we began discussing with the railroad. Informally, the two major concerns we heard were, and I'm getting into slide 15, 16, the two major concerns we heard was, one, disruption to the railroad operation, the tour train, the views. That was one. How can we minimize that? So placing it above the new lower reservoir would significantly help with that. And number two was the fact that the land under the railroad is deeded land to the city, and it was very important. We know it's very important for you to hold on to that land and not be on BLM land. So, but Luigi will touch on, that's a part of the thing we're discussing with the BLM, and that would be addressed in that MOU is negotiating a land swap with the BLM such that the railroad retains the ownership of the land under the newly realigned section. So those are the two big pieces that we're exploring and realize are critical to making it work. And so the current realignment concept is on slide page 17. So that shows it following the contour of the hill and then being aligned above where that new lower reservoir would be. So the rest of we touched on overall project development in slide 18, all the next steps that we're working on in terms of permitting, water, borehole investigations, the next phase of engineering for the project overall, the final location of where that water would be withdrawn for fill, authorization of the state engineer for that, continuing to work with the city and the railway on realignment, and then moving into our FERC draft license application and all the other dimensions of development that we have to do. And so on the final slide 19 just touches on working through this MOU, which basically states our intention to work in a collaborative manner with the railroad and the city, define our mutual commitments, particularly our commitments, and our commitment to cover any costs associated with that process. Continue refining the alignment plan as the project engineering advances, so as that lower reservoir plan gets finalized and adjusted, so would have to the final railroad plan, and then work through that BLM right-of-way process for negotiating a land swap, and then continue going